All right, we'll move right into our first session. It's our keynote speaker, Ken Perlin. Ken's a professor in computer science at NYU, across the river. He's the director there of the Future Reality Lab, where he works in socially blended reality, and that includes a broad range of things. It's pretty interdisciplinary: computer graphics, user interfaces, education. The list of honors is really long, but I think you're much more interested in Ken than what I have to say about Ken. So I'll just mention a few things. Among those many honors he's received is an Oscar from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and he's a fellow in the National Academy of Inventors. So without further ado, Ken, please come up.
Sure. Okay. Good morning. My talk, not surprisingly, is called AI and the Coming XR Singularity. So let's talk about people before we talk about technology. So what do people most want? We basically want to talk to other people. And so we do this every time we get together. It's the first thing we do. And we've been doing this since we were little kids. We've been doing this since before history. We try really hard to create records of our communication with each other using whatever technology we have available. This thing is from about 30,000 years ago. And, but things are different now than they were throughout most of human history. Because as Gordon Moore predicted over 60 years ago, our computer power continues to accelerate. In fact, it pretty much doubles every 18 months. Sometimes it's connection power, sometimes it's CPU, GPU, sometimes it's storage, but something is always jumping exponentially. And we're about to enter an age that's different from the age we're in now, where basically these clunky things are going to be replaced by these much less clunky things, or something that looks like this. And that's going to be fundamental, and I'm going to talk about that and how it works. And obviously the thing you wear on your face isn't going to be doing most of the work. It's mostly going to be an I/O device, but we'll be connected to our phones, which will stay in our pockets, and PCs and the cloud, etc. 5G replaced by 6G, which is about 30 times faster. And this is all happening in the coming 5 to 10 years. So science fiction talks about this stuff. In 2007, Vernor Vinge wrote a great science fiction book called Rainbow's End. It's about 30 years in the future, and everybody wakes up in the morning, pops in their contact lenses, and goes about their day. But meanwhile, the real and the virtual is so intermixed that nobody even thinks about it. And it's really interesting how he explores what that means. And of course, science fiction, you know, our two favorite fictional universes, Star Wars, and this is actually Dollhouse, a great show by Joss Whedon that, if you saw it back in the 2000s, incorporates future technology, and of course Star Trek, have these different ideas that either virtual things show up in our world or we show up together in virtual worlds. But the theme they always have is that they're never isolating experiences. You're always hanging out with other people, which makes sense for fiction because it makes for better stories. So in any case, at some point, virtual objects will show up in our world. And in fact, virtual objects are already in our world. The screen here is, you know, the content of it is a virtual object, which would have totally freaked out somebody from 200 years ago. But we're so used to the fact that this virtual object is in our physical space that we forget that it's not really there. And the same thing will happen when we put on our glasses and we see a physical object in front of us. We'll just accept it. Kids who grow up with it will just say, oh, that's just normal reality. But let's talk about how this coming revolution is going to intersect with the other coming revolution that we're having right now, which is the exponential growth of our data-driven AI power. So we might end up creating these worlds in real time, but we're not going to do it unassisted. And the important part, the really important part is, if I were only talking about something like my Quest 3 there, none of this would matter very much. But in fact, all of the major companies are working really hard on this, and they're spending collectively billions of dollars. It's not just Apple and Meta, it's also Samsung and Microsoft and everybody else, because everybody wants to be the first to capture what will be a mass market when the thing you wear on your face becomes your portal to what you now have to stare at your phone to look at. So instead of doing this, we'll just be looking out there, and which will mean we'll be continuing to interact with the other people in the room with us. So in order to make sense of this, I'd like to talk about memory, because you cannot separate our one human superpower. We only have one human superpower, which is our shared ability to have language, from memory, because language is how we share our memories, and that's what led to all of our technologies. So we use technologies. We can use paper to help jog our memory. You're all using it right now. That's why you can all pretend that you actually recognize the person you're talking to here, kind of furtively looking down. And after we have those XR glasses, what are we going to do with them? Are we just going to put little notes of paper like around us in the world? Maybe there's a more systematic way to think about this. So let's talk about latent space if we're going to talk about AI. What is latent space? Well, we're familiar with this from machine learning. You take any collection of data and you can boil it down to its inherent dimensionality, which is generally much smaller than the size of the data collection itself. And the idea is that then from within that much smaller set, you are able to reconstruct things in that set or even make other examples that weren't in the original set. You can do it with images. And in fact, you can do it with any collection of data. And this means that machines, which cannot think, unlike us, are able to start learning our patterns and storing them in a reasonably efficient way and reconstructing them when we want them to. So AI is not actual intelligence, but it enables us to see reconfigured versions of our own reality in new situations. So human memory is, of course, the impetus for all of this. It was the inspiration when Jan LeCun and his colleagues 20-something years ago were first looking at data-driven AI. They were looking at our own human memory for cognitive neural nets, et cetera. They were attempting to kind of mimic some of the ideas from what we actually have evolved over millions of years in our biological brains. So if you look at something like, my noise function, so that's not just an image, but in fact, here, this is a real-time exploration on the web of, I'm just moving through the Z dimension of my noise function. So on the left is a GPU implementation down there on the bottom. On the right is a CPU implementation. But the important point is that as I move through this, I'm getting an infinite number of instances, but aesthetically, we're in one point. We're still in the same place. I could replace any of these by any of the others of these, and it would make no difference whatsoever. So in fact, if I start to create procedural objects using the noise function, I can swap out instances and you get what to people looks like the same thing. So that's a very small latent space. And we do this all the time. If I start talking to and I say, oh, let's talk about blah, 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 elephant, blah, 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 you don't start thinking of the anatomy of the elephant and all of the details. Instead, you have a gestalt in your idea. If you just think about the idea of an elephant, and that's really much more efficient, that you're going to a very small place in your memory's latent space, and you're just using the token of an elephant rather than having to do some kind of giant encyclopedic dump. It's really the only way that a language can actually work as a way to refer to things without having to go into all their details. So I use this in my research, and I'm sure many people use this in their research. So for example, this is a little procedural robot I made for some kind of online thing we did in our lab. It's got 21 dimensions in its latent space, and I can sort of randomly pick different ones. And here you're seeing just in real time, I'm just going to all different variations of this robot, but in fact, it's all a very, very tiny space, and I can vary any of these knobs. And so you get this idea that having the ability to talk about things in a low dimensional space means we can do very powerful things. For example, the latent space of human faces is actually fairly low dimensional, which is why we can have real-time algorithms that can pick out the faces from an image. And same thing with something like vehicles. All vehicles share so many features that it's relatively easy for a data-driven AI to create the latent space to train an AI and then say, oh, I can recognize everything really fast. So this is really important. There's immense variation in the world, but the way our brains work and the way these machines, which attempt to mimic some of our brain's capacity work, is by looking for these low dimensional spaces. And that's really important because that makes it possible to do things that otherwise would be computationally infeasible. Now, this even happens when two people are having a conversation. You and I start having a conversation and we pick a topic and we're talking about technology or sports or about movies or about maybe I'm having a problem in my relationship and you're helping to talk me through it. But the moment we pick a topic, we are honing in on a shared low dimensional space. We're only talking about that topic. If I'm talking about an issue I'm having with my significant other and you start geeking out about technology, something's wrong. It means we haven't matched our latent spaces. And in fact, the conversation and maybe the friendship will break down. So these are very fundamental things. Because memory is not a tape recording, memory is latent space. And our memory, that small dimensional space that we do this reduction in, and we all do it, connects us with our entire life. It's how we use language to share our lived experiences with each other, and we use our past experience to scaffold our creation of the future together. So when we're all wearing those future XR glasses, our phones will stay in our pockets, and we'll use computation and connection with the cloud, but all of this will be subtly supported by AI, which will use these trained latent spaces to support every conversation. And each one of us will have their AI trained on their own personal space, on who they are. So we've always done this. For centuries, we used books to kind of encapsulate our shared knowledge. And then at some point, technology moved on and we started using movies for that. Like we use movies as cultural reference, and then we moved further and we started making all of this more interactive, and we started using the internet to say, hey, each of us can upload as opposed to it having to go through some official publisher or studio. And then we went even further and we could start all doing this in real time. And that's what the social media is and social networks. So we're accelerating our ability to create culture together, boil it down to its essential points, and find these shared points of communication that can build our conversations. Soon we're going to start using reality itself to do this. And that's really where the AI meets the XR. It's where those two things come together. So your AI, your personal AI, will help you to access your own latent space and make use of it when you need it. It will be an enhancement of yourself, and it will connect you in real time to everything that's going on around you in the physical world and in communication with other people. Now, I want to point out at this point that some of this may sound like science fiction, like what's he talking about, that's kind of crazy, whatever, that's not how reality works. But there are times when reality changes so radically that no one even notices that reality has changed. And usually the more fundamental and radical the change, the less everybody notices it because everyone is suddenly living in the new reality. We had that in 1993 when we got the first web browser. We got that in 2007 when we got the first smartphone. Everybody just adopted this new way of, and because you and your friends and your mom and your neighbors all started doing things differently, we didn't notice that, suddenly a telephone wasn't something that was in your mom's kitchen. It was information that was in your pocket about everything anybody ever did, wherever you went. So suppose, for example, somebody in 2019 said, in 5 years, most meetings will be online. Well, you would just assume that they were describing a Black Mirror episode, because of course, in 2019, there's no way that would have been a reasonable reality in just a few short years. But then COVID happened, and I meet every day with, I talk with my colleagues in China, and we have Zoom meetings, and we don't even think about it. And in fact, we meet online. I've got some of my students here. We could be in the same lab, and we're all just going on Zoom and meeting anyway, partly because we want to be polite to the other people in the meeting who happen to not be in the lab. So we've all radically changed. We've changed everything. We've changed where we live. we've changed our buying habits, we've changed our commuting habits, we've changed our relationships with our families. Everything has radically changed. And we don't even notice it pretty much because we all change together. And the reason I point this out is because this is a common experience that we've all had in the last 5 or 6 years, and it relates to how to think about what will be happening as we move forward into the combination of wearable XR and data-driven AI. So your AI will be trained on everything around you, but it will also be trained on you, and my AI will be trained on me. And they won't be the same, but there'll be commonalities, just as you and I have commonalities. So on your past conversations, all of your life experiences, your emotional reactions that have been observed to things, who you love, who you hate, your relationships, all of this will be fed into something that will help you to be more effective at being you. And what will all of this mean for everyday life? Let's say you're talking at a conference to someone that you met at the same conference 10 years ago, and you're thinking, maybe I would like to collaborate with that person. I remember that we had a fruitful conversation and there was some commonality, but you don't want to look stupid. You want to kind of look like, you were paying attention when they were talking to you the first time. So your AI can help you to recall whatever details are useful about that earlier conversation. And you can learn about what they're working on. It could lead to a collaboration. But here's what's interesting about this is, notice in this picture, this guy's holding his phone. The moment he looks at that phone, the whole thing breaks apart because he's disengaged from the social contract of you and I are focused on each other. So even if he's doing it in order to connect with the other person, we've already lost that sense of you and I are having that superpower that we have as humans that no other species has as far as we know, which is I look at you and I start talking and you start talking and our minds start exchanging ideas very rapidly, which, as I pointed out before, it's how we have everything. It's how we have computers and buildings and that beautiful landscape across the river and chairs and everything. All of our creations come from our ability to work together as a kind of species hive mind, which comes from our evolved instinct for language. Notice language itself is not technology. Language itself is a biological fixed point. It's something that hasn't changed at all in the last tens of thousands of years. We're going to stay the same. We're not going to evolve biologically. So we're basically wrapping all these technologies around our actual inherent superpower, which is language. And that's very important to keep in mind because we can't mess with that one. We can only build from it. So the change when we start going from, I have to look at my phone, or I have to look things up, to having the combination of the right latent space for your AI and then the right interfaces for your XR, it'll be like wearing prescription glasses. Again, the AI itself is not intelligent. The AI itself, like anything else, is a tool to help you. And when you put on your glasses, you don't become some cyber being, some other creature. You can just see better. The tool, in fact, glasses are so successful as a technology, even though they would look really weird to someone from 30,000 years ago, they're so successful technology that if you don't turn your head to the side, you can't tell me who next to you is wearing glasses and not wearing glasses. And generally speaking, about 50% of any group is wearing glasses. So that's a successful technology, is the ones that work so well that they become invisible. And that's kind of where we're going to get to. So it's still you, but you can see better. And that's really the paradigm to keep in your head. It's still you, but you can see better. And so ordinary conversations will soon be visually augmented. And so people won't have to break their eye contact. They'll be able to put ideas out in the space between them. They'll be able to generate a visual representation of thoughts. And that thing about generating visual representation of our thoughts is really radically different from anything that any of us have seen up till now. We haven't had this experience. We can do some of these things with AI tools, but we cannot do them in casual conversation while we're just talking to each other. So let's say you and I are talking, and as we're talking, the very words we're saying are creating things, manifesting things in the world around us. So for example, we're having a conversation and I draw a bird and I say the bird wants to nibble on my plant, so I draw a bird, looks like this, whatever, like a really rough sketch. And I say the bird wants to nibble on my plant, and suddenly I get a bird. And in fact, the bird now has behavior because the AI has infused it, so it starts trying to eat my plant. And now this is what will be normal reality. And so think about the difference between that and where we are now. You want to create something, you want to plan a house, you want to design a play, you want to build an engine, you want to work through a business plan, you just talk to each other. And because the interfaces will be developed to be AI-driven user interfaces, things will start appearing as you talk, and you'll be using your speech and your eye gaze and your gestures to actually make work happen in a highly collaborative real-time way. This is radically different from anything we've been able to do up till now. So we're about to enter a time when we'll each become a higher functioning version of ourselves. We'll still be able to be ourselves, but just as now with your glasses, you can see better. With your combination of XR and AI, you'll have a better memory, you'll have a better ability to turn your ideas into reality, you'll have a better ability to make yourself understood, you'll have a better ability to connect with other people and understand them better. And so all these cognitive improvements will happen not because you're smarter, but because you're using the right tools. So after the XR singularity, and this ties in with the conversation I had about COVID, we may just completely forget that there was ever a time when we lived without these powers. Kids who are born in 2030 will think of a time before this as, the way we think of what was it like before they had indoor plumbing? That was like, nobody could live that way. And meanwhile, through most of history, people lived that way, but we don't want to go back to that. So the world around you, the difference is that the world around you, the physical space as you walk down the street and talk to people, will actually just feel like an extension of your mind. And the interesting thing about this, and the most important thing about this, I think that is the most important takeaway, is that it will not feel like technology. It's just going to feel normal. So I'd like to take the rest of the time to just have a conversation with people. So thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Any questions from the audience?
So I think, from what I understood, you're framing AI a lot in terms of how it can help us connect with other people. But I also feel like I've started to see AI, particularly large language models, in a very different sense, where it's replacing connections with people.
Mm-hmm.
Like you see a lot of people turning to ChatGPT and stuff like that for therapy and things like that, rather than as an extension of how you can further connect with an actual person.
That's a really good point. And in fact, I chose in this presentation to talk about the positive things because I was pretty sure that in the conversation we would get to the other stuff. There was Kranzberg's 10 laws of technology. His first law of technology is not good, and technology is not bad, and technology is not value neutral. So none of the possible positive outcomes or negative outcomes are inherent in the technology. I'm hoping that by taking some people who enable technology and saying, here's where we'd like to go, we can say, okay, we understand positive things, but there are issues of privacy. There are issues, as you point out, of addiction. For example, it didn't work in the 1920s in the US to outlaw alcohol. Prohibition was a failure. In fact, all it did was drive it underground and make it illegal. But on the other hand, we do have to be aware that there are people who are alcoholics, and that we have to be sensitive about that. There are many, many safeguards we have to put in place. Anything can be used. I mean, you can write a book and it inspires people, or Adolf Hitler writes a book and it's his manifesto for killing millions of people. But it's not about the book. It's really about us. So you're absolutely right. We cannot abnegate our responsibility to not only enable things, but also understand what the safeguards are. Now, I'd like to point out that whether we realize it or not, it's never about the technology. The fact that guns exist doesn't mean you're all going to be dead tomorrow, even though technically you could be. Somebody could take a gun and shoot you. The fact that we have locks on our doors is not actually what stops us from having all the stuff in our house or apartment stolen. Anybody who wants to could defeat the technology of your lock or break through your window. It's not that hard. It's that we collectively, as a culture, have decided that it is really important that people have the sanctity of their own home. And so we put in place social constructs, we put in place law enforcement, we put in place its various non-technological consequences. And basically, it's mostly not worth it for people. The lock, in some sense, is a token that if you break this lock, we will come and get you because we care about personal property and space. So we cannot rely on the technology alone to stop the bad consequences you're talking about. We have to remain conscious that it's up to our social construct, it's up to our caring about our family. There is a reason, for example, that in particular, all sides of the political aisle in this country agree that we shouldn't be putting sexualized pictures of children on the internet. There are some things that everybody agrees on, everybody has kids, everybody gets that. So when we all come together, we move beyond technology and we say, this is the world we want. But the problem, as I think you're suggesting, is we have to come together and understand what those things are and then have the will to act on them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I had a kind of similar question in the effort of avoiding a cyberpunk dystopia. What kind of specific safeguards, or not even safeguards, just like methods in the technology itself could you use to encourage more of it being a tool for social interaction rather than a crutch to replace social interaction, or even something that could confuse people as to what is real or what can you actually put, how can you build the technology to encourage that as opposed to what it could likely become?
Well, one of the things we have working for us is that every study that I've been able to find that actually looks at this comes to the conclusion that people do not want, in general, people react really negatively to, I pick up the phone and I talk to somebody and that's pretending to be a human, but it turned out it's an AI, or somebody shows up on my screen and I think I'm dealing with a person. There seems to be this biological, it's wired into our brains, aversion to that thing that isn't a person is passing as a person. This technology wants, people are fine about it in the magic circle of games. It's like, okay, we can pretend, but it's like the difference between I play a war game where I'm pretending to shoot you and I have an actual gun and I shoot you. They're very, very, there are different places in our minds. So I think the technological things we can put in place, like, secure passwords, the guaranteed privacy and encryption, are working together with the fact that I think the will of a citizenry is generally do not cross that Rubicon where no one's going to be able to tell the difference, and it's actually officially cool to fool people into thinking that they're talking to a person. I think that's not even just a legal thing. I think that's a biological imperative of humans. So we have all the technologies we can use that we could list them that put locks in place are actually working with human nature, not against human nature. Which is not to say that everybody is healthy. I mean, as again, there are people who are alcoholics, there are people who are prone to be addicted to drugs. We have to deal with the fact that some people are more vulnerable than others for various reasons.
Hi, I just have a semi-related question on like practical security kind of considerations. I'm curious if you think this is something that's going to be more of an on-device kind of situation rather than a cloud-based or something mixed in between them. Mostly because, you know, thinking about what you were saying about it training itself on you and your environment, that's a lot of data, that's a lot of personalization. Like I realize we already do that with our phones, but have you thought about how you would expect this to work?
I think the solutions that we're evolving with our phones, and they continue to evolve, are setting the pattern for what we're going to do. Some of the security has to be on our personal device, and some of the security has to be in the cloud, and some of the security has to be an algorithmically secure way of those things handshaking. But I don't think we will be inventing entirely new approaches out of whole cloth. Rather, we'll be refining the approaches for the problems that have already been coming up.
Another question. Sorry, here. Ken?
Oh, hi.
Sorry, question about the potential of helping or not helping the people with disabilities, like blind people, deaf people, or autistic people. How do you think this can help, this technology can help these people with their life?
So one of the things that I really like about, so you're asking about people with variously abled people, like if someone is blind or they're hearing impaired, or is that what you're asking? I just want to make sure I heard you properly. Yeah. So one of the things that's positive about this is we have the opportunity to be able to, just as those glasses you're wearing, you know, nobody says, oh, there's a guy who can't see. Like nobody thinks about that. It's like, because we just deal with that on a very non-invasive way. It's like, oh, you can see just fine. You know, and you go to your eye doctor and he changes your prescription as you need it, and it's nobody else's business. So I think that as long as the person who is hearing impaired or sight impaired, or maybe they're on the spectrum and they have difficulty reading facial expressions, so we can use that technology to give people whatever assistance they need, and it's nobody else's business. They can just, you know, participate like people who, you know, have people wear a hearing aid. It's nobody's business if you have a hearing aid. It's not a problem. You're still hearing them. You're just using assistance. Or if there's a technology that, if you're profoundly deaf, will help you with lip reading, et cetera, and just say, okay, look, you can just see the words. It's okay. You're part of the conversation. So I think the positive side of this is that we will have more ways of people being able to contribute if things were stopping them from contributing. Okay, question 2.
Hi, I'm back. The picture of Commander Riker actually reminded me a lot of the. That's good. The focus of it, a lot of it was on personal altered reality, the glasses, the personal AI.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any predictions or ideas surrounding more collective altered reality, such as a holodeck, or where it's not so much geared towards one person at a time, but like whole groups of people.
Well, we do have that. I mean, we've always had that. I mean, we had that with movies. We had that with theater for many, more than centuries. My personal belief about this, and, you know, this is not scientific, but it's just helps me to sort of get a handle about this stuff, is that if you go back 30,000 years to when people were painting those cave paintings in France, and you look at what was happening then, you know, back when people were still hanging out with woolly mammoths before they went away, what did people do and why did they do it? Kids would play, people would tell stories, you know, children playing looks like, you know, maybe it's athletic, it's practice for war, if war is ever going to happen, but meanwhile they're doing it in a very safe way. They're getting exercise. So, you know, people gather around in the village and the elder tells the story. And so these ideas, these fixed points of we like to get together and play. We like to get together and make pretend. I pick up a stick and pretend that it's a weapon. You tell me a story, and think about how weird that is from a rational perspective. Why do I like that you're telling me a story? You know, I pick up a book and I read about a person who doesn't even exist, and I know they don't exist. I go to a play and I know those actors up there, they're not, but nobody stands up in the middle of the audience and says, it's all lies. This isn't real. You're not really Hamlet. He's not really dead. You know, nobody objects because we all understand that what's happening is we evolved as a species to get certain kinds of cognitive and emotional food that helps us to work out what it means to be human. And I don't think there's going to be anything radical about, I mean, our group in 2018 did a shared co-located VR experience where we put everybody in VR headsets in the same room and they all experienced virtual theater together, and thousands of people saw it, and they showed it at at various film festivals, Tribeca Film Festival, et cetera. And it was like, yeah, sure, it makes perfect sense because it maps to what people had already done. So I don't think there's going to be anything we've done it and it's worked and other people have done it. There's not going to be anything surprising about using immersive VR to put people into a shared space. However, I will say that all of the attempts to cross the great Rubicon between this entertainment is a group game and this entertainment is a group story have been very difficult because we seem to have evolved with very different places in our heads for, I am actively lean forward, engaged in a challenge, and I'm sitting back and you're telling me a story. So you see enormous examples of both separately, but you see a relatively small example of crossovers because it seems to be fighting against the way our brains work. But I don't think any of that is about whether it's virtual or not. I think that's just an examination of who we are and who we'll always be, I think.
Hi. When I hear you talking about enhancing people's cognitive capability, first thing coming to my mind is actually how this can help people with cognitive impairments, like Alzheimer or even aphasia, to understand words. But second thing comes to my mind is do you think this because it's kind of like social media, actually increase the equality inequality between the people of how they gathering information, the ability of gathering information. Do you think this will actually close the gap between people's capability, or this will actually increase the gap?
Social media is a good example of something that has been both positive and negative. It's a perfect example of Kranzberg's law in action. I know that I personally write notes to myself, and then I go back the next day and I say, okay, what happened? What did I say I would do? Did I do those things? Oh, I forgot to do this thing. Carries over into the next day, and then I write more notes to myself. And if it gets 3 or 4 days, I start feeling really guilty. And so I'm using, and I would do that on paper if I didn't have a computer. So I think we are all cognitively impaired in every single person in some way. When none of us is this ideal version of ourselves that we'd like to imagine ourselves to be. And so anything that helps us to achieve our goals that's positive. However, we must acknowledge, well, we don't have to acknowledge, but it will still be true even if we don't acknowledge it, that we live in a highly capitalist society where the reason that certain individuals are very, very wealthy is because they're basically providing cognitive drugs to people. So, people will, if you make things convenient for them, they will take the easy way if you give them some sort of positive reinforcement. One thing that started coming to my mind when these things came out, and this thing, the iPhone came out in 2007, and we've been living in that world when you think about it for almost 2 decades. Is if you went back, back in 1970, so Star Trek was only 4 years old. So Captain Kirk got his communicator in 1966. And if you went up to anybody, a young person in 1970, you'd say, by the way, we can make Captain Kirk's communicator real. So you can have this thing in your pocket. It'll tell you, all the stuff from Harry Potter. You'll be able to see where people are in the world, and you'll be able to find your location, and newspapers will be animated. By the way, that's the first Harry Potter book. But if you told people that, they'd be super excited. Said, wow, and all the information in the world is like Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's real. That'd be super exciting. And then they say, yes, of course, everyone wants that. And then you say, by the way, the government and large corporations will always know exactly where you are and what you're doing and who you're with and what you're up to and everything that you purchased. And they'd all look at you and like, what are you smoking? Pot or something? Nobody would want that. There's just no way a society would agree to that. And now, fast forward, about half a century, we live in that world. And the reason we live in that world is because we're a capitalist country and we have large corporations that understand if we dangle convenience in front of you, you're going to follow the little ball. And that's the way our economy works. I don't particularly like it, but I have to acknowledge that we've been gradually moving step by step into that space. If we want to do something about it, then we have to talk about how we do something about it. But the technology itself is neither the problem nor the solution. We can use the technology, but we have to figure out if we want a different way of doing things, if we want to have a greater premium on privacy. Maybe I don't want to have the same deal with Facebook or Meta or Google or Microsoft or Amazon or whatever. It sure is convenient that I go to Amazon, something shows up my door the next day, but there's a reason for that, because that is the data they gather from you is incredibly economically valuable to them to sell to advertisers. And so it's an important conversation, but I don't think it's a conversation that's primarily about technology, although we will certainly have to use technology if we want to do anything to shift the current paradigm.
So going back to what we're talking about, like the whole share bird experience and the shared experience with someone else, would a good example of like a use case for this in real world would be like construction. Like, hey, we're showing someone like a plot of land to build a house, and I could show them, wait, we're gonna build 2 walls here.
Yeah.
We're gonna have paintings here, and then like I think that would be like an ideal like business use case early on.
Yeah, and in fact, in our lab, we use those use cases, construction. How would you build an eco-friendly city or something with better traffic, or how would you make a better interior? Those cases are actually really low-hanging fruit for this kind of thing. If you live in a house or an apartment and you're experiencing some problems with your electrical or with your plumbing, so the standard thing now is somebody comes in and they start tearing out your drywall, and it's going to put dust everywhere and cost you tens of thousands of dollars, and then it all has to get put back together again. But if you take these guys and you walk up and you say, oh, that's where the conduit is, or that's where you could drive a nail there and it would go into something, because I'm seeing right through the walls, because we've actually constructed things using methods that are consistent with where things are going to go. So all of these things that we could do, but nobody thinks to do it because we don't yet have the consumer device. We haven't gone into that world yet. And the person who is doing this doesn't want to be holding up a phone because they need to have their hands free. So in fact, you're finding that in certain industrial sectors like construction, like warehouses, like manufacturing, those are the places, and in some cases medical, where you're getting early adopters of people wearing something because it's worth it to them, because it matters that much. But then you have to have the entire pipeline of the industry put the information into the physical space for that to actually be useful. But that's gradually happening. That will accelerate once they're no longer big clunky headsets and they start to be something more consumer friendly and accessible. But yeah, well, your point is well taken. So that it always happens in industry first, because the money at stake, and then it gradually goes down. So I'm actually quite happy that everything that we're doing now with these things is actually already relevant to industries, and so we're able to work these things out because medical and construction and manufacturing already say, oh, we'll put a headset on you, an XR headset, because it matters to our bottom line. And then once hundreds of millions of people have these, that everyone else will reap the benefits.
Okay. Hi, Ken. Okay. I wonder, given that the current VR headsets like the Apple Vision Pro is very technically powerful, but they are still relatively heavy, and they tend to use only in a specific scenario like VR games. So I wonder, how long do you think it will take before the VR glasses become seamlessly integrate our daily life as a smartphone today?
My belief is that it's going to be sometime in the next 5 years.
5 years.
Just because I don't think that the large players would be tipping their hands as publicly as they are now unless they were confident that they could push a product on us by 2030. They've been working on it for many years, but they've been very quiet about it. And now they're starting to get public about it. There's a whole conversation going on between Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook that I'm sure I know people were having behind the scenes for many years, but now they're having it in front of all of us. So I think the products will be coming out in the next 5 years.
I have a question about kind of follow up the previous question about use cases such as construction and this kind of industrial. So I'm wondering about what's kind of the economic incentive in this case. Namely, like, why would companies create such products? Like, how would they benefit profit-wise? And my question comes from perspective. I used to work at Google, where there was like either a product has reach of next billion users, or forget about this. So lots of those applications are fairly niche, and they would require substantial amount of work unless there exists some kind of shared framework that would allow for very quick development and deployment.
Yeah, I mean, there was a bank robber in the 1930s named Willie Sutton who wrote a book about his career as a bank robber. And a reporter asked him at the book opening, why did you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. So I think that's the point here is if there's money in it, if it makes the bottom line work better, then, and it matters in terms of, now, by the way, the first sectors that made use of VR in any significant way, not surprisingly, were the medical field and the military field, because in both cases, lives are at stake. And losing a life is actually a very, very big deal if you want to not lose life. In fact, the first people at NYU that used VR wasn't us. The first people at VR at NYU were in the medical center, the people who did brain surgery. So they wanted to use VR to plan the route through the brain so they wouldn't destroy healthy tissue when they remove the tumor. It all depends on what the stakes are. So the higher the stakes, and after human life comes financial stakes, the more likely that is to be an early adopter. Because early adopters have to deal with technology that is not meant for consumers. So it parallels what we've all seen in the computer graphics field. The only people who did 3D computer graphics at first were the people who took, back in the 1980s, 90s, were doing half-year training sessions to learn Maya. It was so high-end, it was so expensive to sit in front of one of those 3D computers that you had to have high-end people and you invested in them. And then we had the game revolution, where suddenly cheap PCs could do 3D, and it's like, oh, you don't need training. And then eventually by 2013, we got to things like ShaderToy, where any 12-year-old could go write shader code and post it on the web. But so that's why Moore's law is so important. The early adopters are the ones where it matters so much. First, things about life, and then things about major construction costs. I mean, the construction costs involved in any sort of capital endeavor, building a building, are so large. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. To build a shopping center costs hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you can shave $20 million off of that, it's worth spending $1 million investment to shave $20 million off. So the very last thing that happens is the big market, which is the consumers, the cheap market with hundreds of millions of people, because that's the tail end. And that's when everything gets available to everybody. But every technology seems to follow that similar curve. You were raising your hands forever. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I have two questions. Part of it is about the technology and part of it is about the social consequences. So I think a lot of the concern with AI right now is the hallucinations, because it's not based on like mathematical proofs, it's trying to predict. So I'm wondering, do you think like if we're trying to personalize this, it will have to like ask you your feedback for like every conversation you have at the end of the day or something? So that's my first question. And my second question is, if we want to make it personalized, it would have to not only record you, but it's kind of like recording everyone you're talking to. And so that might be a privacy concern. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so as far as, let's see, your first question, what was your first question?
Hallucinations. And so I guess
I've noticed that when you look at the results of Midjourney and its equivalents, and you really, as a human, very, very quickly hit that low dimensionality of that latent space. Like, it gets boring really fast. Any actual human being, even if they're not a very good artist who does something, it's interesting. But the AIs tend to, we're really good pattern matchers, and we start hitting that kind of, oh, it's the same thing over and over and over and over again. And it gets boring. And I think there's something good about the fact that we are really good at noticing, we are really good at forming latent spaces and therefore recognizing when something has a low dimensional latent space. And I don't believe that the future of AI is going, I mean, when the first pianoforte came out in the late 1700s, there was this giant musician strike in Europe because the word was that the piano was going to replace the orchestra. And in the 1830s, when the first photographs were taken, there was a Supreme Court ruling in the US that said, where somebody who had a photograph taken to them said, I own that because I'm the person in the picture. And the Supreme Court said, that's right. You're the person in the picture. That's just a machine. But within the next 10 years, they realized it's not the machine. It's the person holding the machine. And the copyright belongs to the person. So it's just a tool. Right now, like any new tool, people are confused by what it means. But people who are very talented, who will use AI, will produce amazing things. And people who are hacks who use AI will just produce really, really boring things that ultimately nobody's going to want to see. And our tools evolve. Photography didn't end painting. Movies didn't end theater. People recognize that they're different media. Steven Spielberg is not untalented because he uses a camera. He's just applying his genius in a different way. So I think that it's the newness of it that are getting people to confuse the human and the machine they use. And I don't think that that is what is going to happen in the long run. So what was your second question?
Privacy concerns because it's recording everyone else you're talking to.
Yeah, I remember very distinctly about 15 years ago, the very first time I was in a meeting and somebody picked up their phone and took a picture, and I showed up online somewhere, and I was like, what? I didn't agree to show up online. And it's like, they didn't even think about it. They just took a picture of the meeting and suddenly my face was online. So I don't think there is any way technologically to draw those boundaries, but I do think that, again, as we try to protect children from being exploited, I think that there are certain social and cultural norms that we rise to the occasion when it really matters to us. So when a compromise of someone's privacy will cause harm in a well-functioning society, we understand how to recognize and deal with that case, and then we bring in appropriate technologies to do so.
Last question.
This is just a quick follow on to that one. I'm just thinking about the recording thing, and I'm pretty sure in some states, right, like they have like two-party consent laws, so it might actually be a legal concern, right? Like if you were to record someone else without their knowledge, that's part of the technology. So it might not just be a societal thing that we have to avoid.
Yeah, you will actually legally, you're not allowed to just record a phone conversation without the person knowing. I mean, people might do it anyway, but they're actually breaking the law when they do it. So that's a good point. And therefore, there are consequences.
Ken, thank you for being so generous with your time.
Sure.
Everybody, Ken Perlin.
Thank you.